Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural session of the fall 2023 season of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, our annual William Roger Lewis Lecture centers on a recent book by Timothy Garton Ash entitled Homelands, A Personal History of Europe, published last May by Yale University Press. Our discussants this afternoon are Christina Spohr of the London School of Economics and Holly Case of Brown University. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University. I co-chair the Washington History Seminar, along with Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Unfortunately, because we had to reschedule today's event from last Monday, Christian can't join us this afternoon. For those of you who don't know, the Washington History Seminar is a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association that focuses on new scholarship for well over the past decade. A few FYIs before we get going. First, please take note. The next seminar will take place in just a few days on Monday, September 18th at 4 p.m. when we return to discuss a new book by Andrew Port of Wayne State University entitled Never Again, Germans and Genocide After the Holocaust, a book published by Harvard University Press last May as well. Second, as always, we like to recognize two people whose hard work behind the scenes makes these seminars possible. Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the American Historical Association. Third, on the logistics front, please note that today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And then finally, when we get to the question and answer part of the seminar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function on Zoom. That allows you to actually pose a question in your own voice, or you can use the Q&A function on Zoom as well, in which case I get to read your question. And we'll try to call on as many folks as we can. So with those preliminaries out of the way, let's get the seminar fully underway. Our distinguished author this afternoon is Timothy Garton Ash, a scholar and astute observer of international politics who has been traveling and studying and writing about and worrying about Europe for the past 50 years. He is professor of European Studies at the University of Oxford and the author of numerous books of contemporary history and political writing, including The Magic Lantern, The Revolution of '89, Witnessed in Warsaw, Budapest, Berlin, and Prague, and most recently, today's book, Homelands, A Personal History of Europe. In 2017, he was awarded the International Charlemagne Prize for service to the European Union, and we are delighted that he's joining us today to launch this season's seminar programming. Timothy, welcome to the seminar. The screen is all yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you, actually from Washington now. I finally got here, although the background is Oxford, and a great pleasure to be discussing this book with Christina and Holly, two historians whose work I've much admired and learned from. This book took me just 50 years to write. 50 years of traveling around Europe, as you said, witnessing events, talking to people, writing things down in little notebooks like this one, but also more conventionally studying European history in libraries and archives, worrying about Europe, writing about Europe. And it's an unusual genre. It's history illustrated by memoir and reportage. Not classic memoir, not classic reportage. The stories, the anecdotes are all there to illuminate the history. And then, unlike much of my earlier work in the genre of history of the present, this one I am revisiting with the benefit of hindsight, right? So knowing consequences I didn't know at the time, a more classical position for the historian, and drawing on the latest scholarship while I'm about it. So stories illustrating the history. For example, a story I told in The Magic Lantern, walking up a street in East Berlin, just a day after the Berlin Wall comes down, and I meet a very excited East Berliner who says he's just seen an improvised poster saying, "Only today is the war really over," right? November 1989. And that seems to me actually to be a profound truth, that in fact for Europe behind the Iron Curtain only in 1989. Was the war really over? 2 years later, I'm sitting in opposite Helmut Kohl in his office in Bonn. Helmut Kohl was, as those of you who met him will know, certainly the largest human being I've ever met. Enormous, both in height and girth, a mountainous man. He's towering over me. And suddenly he says, do you realize you're sitting opposite the direct successor to Adolf Hitler? And what does one say in response? Quite the conversation stopper. What I should have said is, actually, Herr Bundeskanzler, there was Grand Admiral von Dönitz in between. So you weren't the last, you're not the direct successor to Adolf Hitler. But of course, the point that Kohl was making, and that's the point of the story, is he was deeply conscious of his historical responsibility and wanted to do everything differently. Hitler had tried to put a German roof over Europe. He was going to put a European roof over Germany. Now, of course, this cannot begin to be a comprehensive history of Europe over the last 50 years, let alone since 1945, which is a wider time frame. This is the story of Europe and freedom, two leitmotifs of my work. That is the key to the story I'm trying to tell. And from that point of view, it's a story of two halves. When I started traveling in Europe as a very young man in the early 1970s, most Europeans were still living under dictatorships. We actually did the numbers for this book. If you include the European republics of the Soviet Union, 289 million Europeans were living in democracies, 389 million in dictatorships, right? Including, of course, Spain, Portugal, and Greece. Starting with the end of the dictatorships in Southern Europe, Spain, Portugal, and Greece, you have, painting with a very broad brush, this upward curve across the next roughly 30 years, I argue until 2007, in the spread of freedom, of democracy, and the enlargement of the geopolitical West. So 1972, European Community, still only 6 countries and NATO 15. By 2007, it's 27 and 25 respectively. Of course, it wasn't a simple, uninterrupted, continuous upward progress. 5 wars in former Yugoslavia, martial law in Poland, 9/11, of course, as we remember this week. Although, interestingly, and this we might want to discuss, one of the things that really struck me in working on this book is that while 9/11 is clearly a major turning point in US history and Middle Eastern history, it does not seem to me to be a major turning point in European history. For me, the major turning point in European history is 2008. The near simultaneous impact of 2 events, the beginning of the global financial crisis and Vladimir Putin's seizure of 2 great chunks of Georgia, both summer, early autumn 2008, starts a cascade of crises in what I call the downward turn, the faltering of the project that takes us right through the next 15 years. So the global financial crisis segues into the Great Recession in many European countries, crucially into the Eurozone crisis, which of course lasts many years on and off, hitting Southern Europe particularly hard. In 2010 already, Viktor Orban starts to demolish democracy in Hungary. 2014, you have the seizure of Crimea and the beginning of the Russia-Ukrainian war, which, as Ukrainians remind us, didn't start last year. It started more than 9 years ago. 2015, the refugee crisis, followed by Brexit, Trump, the electoral remarkable performance of Marine Le Pen, of the AfD in Germany, the Law and Justice Party in Poland starts to emulate Orban's example, and the COVID pandemic, all the way down to the 24th of February 2022 and the beginning of the largest war in Europe since 1945. So the larger bookends of this book are the end of a major war in Europe in 1945, which is where, of course, the story has to begin, and the beginning of another major war in Europe last February. And within that, I distinguish between the post-war period, which, of course, Tony Judt famously made his own in his book Post-War, and what I call the post-wall period, starting on the 9th of November 1989. And I'm going to argue, although very tentatively, because we're very close to it, and again, this is something we might like to discuss, that one might suggest that the post-wall period actually ends on the 24th of February 2022, and that we are probably now in a different period whose name and character is unknown. Now, just as this earlier period of the upward curve, which I mentioned a moment ago, just as that is not uninterrupted, it has major crises and setbacks along the way, so this downward turn, this cascade of crises, I don't use the term polycrisis because polycrisis kind of suggests that they were all simultaneous, whereas in fact it's a chain of crises, each reinforcing the other. In this same period, we actually can argue that the European Union has not just survived these crises, but in significant respects become stronger as a result of surviving the crises. So that, for example, the Next Generation EU project, which breaks two fundamental taboos of North European creditor nations like Germany in the Eurozone, namely mutualized debt and actual grants rather than loans for half that, 750 billion euros. That comes in response to the COVID crisis, but is a major step forward for the Eurozone. One could argue it should have been done much sooner. The European Union, obviously, also in response to the war in Ukraine, is acquiring something more of a security and defense identity with the European Peace Facility and the European Defense Fund. So it's not an uninterrupted downward turn. Nonetheless, there is clearly something to be explained about why, after such a period of extraordinary progress, we went into this cascade of crises. And this is where I want to spend a few minutes just looking at a couple of hypotheses or possible explanations, and then go into the discussion. And obviously, I can't discuss all of them. There are, for example, many varieties of hubris, which I talk about in the book, which I think is an important part of the explanation. But I'm going to single out just two, because they're both about, in a way, not learning the lessons of history. And this is, after all, a history seminar. The first is that I think that the kind of fundamental mistake underlying a lot of these individual examples of hubris was what I call a historiosophical mistake, a mistake in the understanding of how history happens. Put most simply, it was the fallacy of extrapolation. We, liberal Europeans, Americans, and others, took the way history had gone for any number of years, particularly in the first half of the post-war period since 1989, and simply extrapolated forward. Yes, there would be setbacks, but this was the broader course of history. We took the most non-linear event in modern European history, namely the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War and the Soviet Union, and made a linear projection forward from it. Or to state the case most generally, we took history with a small h, history as it really happens, which is always the interaction of deep structure and process on the one hand, and contingency conjuncture, chance, collective will, and individual leadership on the other, and turned it into history with a capital H. History as a Hegelian process of the inevitable progress towards the spread of freedom. But freedom is not a process. Freedom is always a struggle. This is what we've forgotten, what the Ukrainians are reminding us of. For me, one of the words of the year is the Ukrainian word volia, which is a very interesting word because it combines the meanings of freedom and willpower. There is actually a German equivalent, Freiheitswille, not often mentioned by German politicians until the war in Ukraine. So that seems to me a fundamental mistake that many of us made, although I do just want to say, because a few of you have the words Francis Fukuyama on your lips, that this was not, in my view, typically the mistake of the early 1990s. Of course, there was liberal triumphalism in the early 1990s, but actually, if you look at it, in the early 1990s, we were extremely uncertain about how things were going to go. My friends in East Central Europe had no idea if they could successfully make the transition from communism to democracy, from a centrally planned economy to a market economy. Most of the big projects of the European Union were still ideas to be realized. Even the single market had not been fully completed. The currency union was just an idea. The great enlargement had not happened. It seems to me that this hubris based on this historiosophical mistake rarely sets in the early to mid 2000s. It's precisely when everything seems to have gone so well and we're saying mission accomplished that the problems begin. The other, and with this I'll close and hand it over to the discussants. The other is a more specific lesson of history which we failed to learn. Many of you on this webinar will know the work of the wonderful German historian Reinhard Koselleck. And Koselleck has a wonderful essay which is called The Unknown Future and the Art of Prognosis, in which he makes a very simple but powerful point, which is the more often a phenomenon recurs in history, the more examples we have of a phenomenon, the more likely we are to be able to make probabilistic statements about such phenomena in the future. So, for example, the statement, we will all die, can be made with a rather high level of probability, because in a vast historical data set, there's no known example to the contrary. Revolutions, wars, what happens to people who've been in power too long? All these are recurrent phenomena, which we have sufficient examples to have a sense of how things probably might go when they recur. Now, another such phenomenon is declining empires. Here's the thing about declining empires. They don't like it. Ask the British, ask the French, ask the Portuguese. After all, West European colonial powers spent nearly 30 years after 1945 fighting often quite brutal colonial wars to protect their colonial possessions, even in this Europe which was proclaiming the motto of never again. So when the largest surviving empire in Europe, an empire that had grown over centuries, the Russian and Soviet Empire, softly and suddenly vanished away in the space of just 3 years in 1989 to 1991, we shouldn't have thought that was the end of the story. As I tell the story in the book of meeting Vladimir Putin as a totally unknown deputy mayor of St. Petersburg in 1994, sits quiet at the conference table for nearly a day and suddenly pipes up and says, there are territories that have historically always belonged to Russia, and the Russian Federation has an interest in their future, and he explicitly mentions Crimea. Of course, you can't simply draw a straight line from Putin 1994 to Putin 20 years later, 2014, actually seizing Crimea. A lot has to happen in between. But the basic revanchist impulse, the basic feeling that we have to get that imperial greatness back so far as possible is there already 3 years after the end of the Soviet Union. So that when the empire actually started striking back, I mean, Transnistria, you might say, in Moldova, the Chechen wars, of course, but the Chechen wars weren't across international frontiers. So 2008, and above all 2014, then I think we should have recognized what was happening, that this was a classic phenomenon of a declining empire striking back. And in my view, 2014 is the turning point at which the West failed to turn. I would argue that if we had a much stronger response to Russian aggression in 2014-15, we might not be in the mess we're in now, in the largest war in Europe since 1945. So that is to say that it's worth studying history, and just occasionally, perhaps one can even learn from it. And with that, I look forward very much to the conversation.
Thank you very much. Our first discussant this afternoon is Christina Spohr, who is Professor of International History at the London School of Economics and Political Science and Senior Fellow at the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Studies at SAIS Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. She is a specialist in the international history of Germany since 1945, and she's interested in questions of world order, diplomacy, and strategy, and the practice of applied history. She's the author of a dozen books or edited volumes, and her most recent monograph was Post-Wall, Post-Square, Rebuilding the World After 1989, a book that was part of the Washington History Seminar a number of years ago. She is now a fellow at the Wilson Center and working on a global history of the Arctic. Christina, welcome back to the seminar.
Thank you, Eric, very much for inviting me to this panel to comment with Holly on Timothy's personal history of Europe. And Timothy threw up a few really important, wider interpretative points, how we look at contemporary Europe in sort of the last 10 minutes or so. But in the beginning of my comments, I would actually first like to talk about him as the author of this rather extraordinary book. I think Timothy's book is unique, both in form and in content. And since we are a history seminar, there's a few things I want to say about that. I think if anyone can genuinely be the voice of a generation, the late 1968ers, as he says, where he sort of falls, it is Timothy. He draws on memoirs and journals and conversations and photographs and also the obvious archival sources and speeches and interviews. But it is, as he said himself, it really is a history illustrated by memoir. And what I think is really striking is that he, and I want to emphasize this, is in this transatlantic setting, that as an Englishman, he came to look at first as an outsider into the heart of the continent before, in my view, becoming an insider. And in some ways, to pick up on the title of his book, a European with many homelands in Europe. And I think if we sort of leaf through the pages of his books, which really cover 75 years or so, in other words, that Europe divided post-war, and also reunited post-war, we come to realize what really makes this personal history and journey so compelling. I mean, one has to be envious, especially when one is of Holly's and my generation. He somehow always seemed to be at the right place at the right time. And history in Europe at every juncture literally seemed to be unfolding right in front of his eyes. And I think what is really amazing is that he is somebody with a skill set of an Oxford-trained historian, an instinct and talent to zoom in what matters and to contextualize it, as well as then the journalist knack to quickly jot down, to sharply analyze, and to evocatively convey what was happening. Because also he seemed to always have the conversations that mattered with the people who mattered, and then everything in the respective mother tongues of those people. So how come that this man from southern England had come at home in a divided Cold War Europe? Of course, like many others of his generation from Britain, he had taken a trip to Normandy beaches. His father had fought in the war against the Nazis. He participated in an Anglo-French school exchange, and he even went to Bavaria on a Goethe Institute course, we learn, where he honed his language skills in German, but not just with Germans, in fact, with a Greek roommate who, to his puzzlement, was more interested in German discourse and German girls than delving into Nietzsche. So there you see already the beginnings of a different trajectory. But then, starting off as a postgraduate student in West and East Berlin in the late 70s and 80s, he was actually drawn into Central Europe, the exotic communist states beyond the Iron Curtain, the GDR, of course, but then also Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia. And the longer he stayed, the more he seemed to imbibe Europe. And I want to quote what he said so pithily in his book. He said, "With every language I learned, I became a bit more European, more capable of seeing myself as another and more detached from the monolingual certainties of my father's England." So Timothy was there during the first Polish Revolution when Solidarity was born and during the mesmerizing visits of Pope John Paul to his communist but deeply Catholic homeland. But in these years, he also met his future Polish wife. So the personal and the professional were complementary and perhaps even mutually reinforcing. We learn about his road trips in the Eastern Bloc in that funky blue Alfa Romeo, not just any old VW Polo or perhaps a Trabi or Lada. And that the Stasi noticed too, because Romeo, Timothy would later learn and share with us in a book, became the code name of his lengthy Stasi file. Although, of course, he wasn't a British spy. In 1989-90, already told us about the book The Magic Lantern. He bore witness in Warsaw, in Budapest, in Berlin, in Prague to the peaceful revolutions when the Soviet Empire by imposition dissolved as the communist regimes were toppled. Gorbachev abstained from using military force, having abolished the Brezhnev Doctrine, in other words, no Czechoslovakia in 1968, and when the Berlin Wall fell and Germany reunited. His passion lay in all things European, especially in the edgy places of change, of bouleversement, and of course, more sort of conceptually speaking, of the transition from plan to market, from communist dictatorship to liberal democracy and political pluralism. But he also kept an eye on London, Paris, Rome, and Brussels, on the tortuous integration drive of the EC to the EU, and the quiet disintegration of the Soviet Union that stood in sharp contrast to the violent implosion of Yugoslavia. So how did this all happen, and above all, why? These were always, and I think still are, his pressing questions to which answers need to be found, for which evidence and sources are always collected, as he showed us with his little notebooks there. So during the 90s, he would not just reflect on his Romeo file and also learn how the East German security apparatus interpreted his every move, but on the mechanics of writing a history of the present and also exploring in Europe's name the German question. In fact, two books that are underlying reference points in Homelands, in this personal history we're discussing today, but which, and I want to mention this especially because they were important to me. They shaped my student days. I'm German-Finnish by birth, and so I'm a Nordic and West European insider. I'm generationally a late 1989er, as he would classify it, of those people who sort of came of age around the hinge years of 89 to 92. I came to study contemporary Europe in Britain in the 90s because there was thankfully that Maastricht, Europe's amazing freedom of movement and open border regime. It was possible to inquire what Europeanness meant by looking in from the somewhat more skeptical British vantage point, by now being in Blair's cool Britannia. That's something he talks about in his book as well. And in fact, his books and essays ever since would accompany me. So we have never met in person. In fact, the closest we have gotten is sitting here on the Zoom today. But through his constant flow of publication and commentary, he was somehow always sort of an indirect interlocutor of mine all along. And in Homelands, in this current book we're discussing, beyond his customary erudition, there's a real intimacy and granularity to all these observations that he makes. His descriptions of East Central European societies, of the places and people, the workers, the intellectuals, the protesters, the Communist Party bosses. All of those are really amazingly vivid and dynamic. And he calls this, and I think it's a wonderful word, a kaleido tapestry, where he blends across time and space the voices of the car mechanics, of the waitresses, of the academics, with those of the great political leaders of our time, all of whom Timothy appears to have met. And I want to just give you some flavor. He talked to Bronislaw Geremek during the strikes in Lenin shipyards in Gdansk in August 1980, and then he keeps visiting him after he becomes Polish foreign minister. He jokes with the Czechoslovakia-born Madeleine Albright in the 1990s about what she called the Euro mess, as she gives him a copy of her staff's diagram showing all the overlapping European organizations. And I've seen that diagram. There's like lots and lots of little circles going around. He chairs a retrospective summit meeting with Gorbachev, Kohl, and Bush. He has tea with Tony Blair in the Garden Hut, and he chats with ex-Portuguese European Commission President Barroso and the Spanish ex-Secretary General of NATO, Javier Solana, when he ponders the attraction of the institutional West for the Balts, East Central, as well as Southern Europeans. All part of the NATO and EU enlargement stories, in fact, from the 1980s to the present. And that's something I also want to highlight. He spends quite considerable time in his book also reminding us that Greece, Portugal, Spain, countries with very authoritarian, even fascist regimes became democracies and entered the European community in the 1980s. And then, of course, I already mentioned this, but I had made a note to myself. You mentioned that half asleep in St. Petersburg 30 years ago, you were awoken by this, and I quote, short, thick-set man with an unpleasant, rat-like face, apparently some sort of sidekick in the city's mayor. That man whose name is Vladimir Putin. So your first impression, that's of course the strength of journalists also. Often it's that first instinct, that first conversation, something that sticks to your mind, but it's intuitive and it is conveying something that has definitely a grain of truth and that will stick. In Homelands, in that sense, I think history is really alive as we soak up that European world and its key protagonists through Timothy's eyes and thoughts, and through the stories of his interlocutors. And that is people at the grassroots level, but also the change agents, the managers of change, the political leaders, in fact, political leaders that he highlights who were of consequential nature for our experience of European history in the last 50 years or so at least. So it must be noted that his author's voice is at once many different things. I think it's inquisitive, but it's also full of empathy. I think it's humane, but it's also, in that sort of historian's way, thoughtful. And I think the questions that you ask are always intelligent while you're looking for very well-measured explanations. And if I may say so, the Englishman, for all your Europeanness and outlook, shines through thanks to your humor and occasional self-deprecation. There is a multi-perspectival character in each short chapter. The chapters are sort of 4 to 8 pages long, and they could be read as individual essays, which is sort of fun. In each, Timothy looks into a particular historical episode qua personal experience, your own or that of your interlocutors. He pursues his questions always from more than one direction, because you try to hold opposed views in a balance, and you try to put yourself into the shoes of others, even though your own distinctly liberal views are clearly conveyed. There were 4 book sections in the beginning, which I think are part of the sort of ascendancy story. The Europe destroyed by war and then divided, but then Europeans rising and triumphing. In the latter one, you have taken that 9/11 moment. And those are in some ways already firmly history, both in a personal, but I think in a scholarly sense. You write as a historically informed commentator and observer, but you remain outstanding and clear, even in current affairs as we go on. That was always your strength. It's still your strength. And I think something to say just about those last chapters: Euro crisis, Brexit, Charlie Hebdo, invaders, demolition, war of the Ukraine. Here we relive the shocks, the anger, the sadness, the deep uncertainties and fear of our era, the times of a post-war Europe originally aspiring to be whole and free, that the Russia's war of conquest, more than any of the aforementioned cascade of crises, has now definitely brought to an end. I think your book is about more than just pushing a certain thesis or a singular explanation for our current epochal turning point. It is about taking us readers on your journey, uncovering through layers of personal experience, a plethora of individual stories and memories, how and why things happened the way they did post-war and post-war. So this book is about inquiry and about taking multiple viewpoints to get a better understanding of Europeans' choices and Europe's fate in recent history. And in that sense, I think we have in front of us a really wonderful kaleidoscopy in our hands. And here is the book. So I have a few questions, if I may. And there I want to pick up a few things that you also said about, how we look at this recent period. But first of all, depending on who sort of sits in the audience, I would actually like to ask you, considering that works of history and academic writing and commentary often conceal identity, you do exactly the opposite here. In some ways, what exactly are you doing when you construct this narrative where you are literally present in your writing? How do you think the role of the historian and eyewitness and journalist interact? And what about this memory engine you keep talking about? That would be the first question.
I think you can respond to that, Timothy, if you wish.
I see. Well, very good. Okay, so thank you so much, Christina. That was such a wonderful review of the book, really. I just very quickly to pick up two things you said. First is, I'm so glad you picked up on the title. For me, if you ask what is the most characteristic feature of being a European today, it is that you can be at home abroad, right? So you're in Paris, you're in Berlin, you're in Budapest, you're in Tallinn, you're clearly abroad. It's a very different country, but you're also in some important sense at home, hence homelands in the plural, not the pathos-laden Europa als Heimat, right? Not Europe as a single homeland, because it isn't, homelands in the plural. And secondly, I just want to say that I'm so glad you picked up on the issue of languages, which of course is also hugely present in Holly's work. I mean, The Age of Questions is an extraordinary range of linguistics, which is of course one of the really striking features of Europe, the incredibly intense linguistic diversity, which is a really important constraint on what Europe can become politically. It's not only one of the great riches of Europe, it's also a real constraint, so that for me, the European project is about finding the right balance between unity and diversity, not simply seeking unity. Very quickly to your question, no historian, journalist, or writer is ever objective. They're never on Mount Olympus. They're also always writing the history of their own times. And therefore, you can either strive for what has been called due impartiality, or you can do what I do, which is honest partiality, like George Orwell, right? So for me, Homage to Catalonia is a great model. You tell the reader exactly where you stand, not just physically and emotionally, but also intellectually and ideologically. You level with the reader, but at the same time, I go to great lengths to be accurate, to be fair, to look at it also from the point of view of the other side. So that's how I'm going about it. If you want it in one word, it's the Orwellian model.
Then I would like to ask you about this aspect of freedom and democracy, because I think that runs through an entire book. In some ways, your early journeys to the East were focused on the political dissidents, the desire for freedom, democracy, and democratization. And also, what is in some ways is sort of catching up with the West, as, Ivan Krastev has also talked about. And then, of course, you turn to the more recent phenomena of de-democratization and the emergence of illiberal democracies as part of that disillusionment of the so-called Western model. So I'm wondering about the following. I mean, the word democracy is sort of complicated because, of course, you know, depending how one uses it, the Soviet Empire used to talk about people's democracies. And we who grew up in the West would speak about liberal democracy. And of course, the democracies are fickle. They can be volatile given the electoral cycles. The societies need to learn about the robustness of the system, the transparency, the separation of power, something that's also really important in the current American context. So do you think, now taking this historical view that you sort of highlighted towards the end of your talk, did we get it wrong when we stressed democracy, perhaps more than liberalism, more stressing democratization rather than liberalization? But is there a problem with that word liberal democracy? Because on the other hand, when we think about the global economy, people keep banging on about, you know, neoliberal free market. So there's a sort of problem with that word liberal as well. So the question of, if we think about what the hopes for that better world were, you know, is it democracy? Is it the liberalness? Is it the openness of society? How do we integrate this aspect that is important in many parts of Europe, perhaps now less so than in Britain, but, you know, this aspect of social justice, a social charter also in the EU versus this complete free market. How do we deal with this word democracy, de-democratization? Is it as bad? What do you make of that, this problem with the terms?
So my key term is not democracy, it's freedom. Mm-hmm. It's actually quite unusual. If you look at the literature, particularly the political science literature, it's overwhelmingly on the category of democracy. Mine is on the question of freedom and therefore necessarily on the question of liberalism, because at the heart of any liberalism worthy of the name is individual liberty. And so this book is also about what went wrong with liberalism, and that is a great deal. And to put it very simply, liberalism was in large measure reduced to its purely economic dimension. It allowed unprecedented levels of inequality to develop, not just economic inequality, but also what I call inequality of attention and respect, right? So it was the neglect of the egalitarian underpinnings of liberalism, which you find in the work of Ralph Dahrendorf, for example, who said for liberty, you need a common floor of housing, of education, of healthcare, of meaningful work. Or Ronald Dworkin, whose central formula of liberalism, he said at the heart of liberalism was equal respect and concern for each individual, right? And that has both the economic, social, and the cultural dimension. So that's an absolute theme of the book. Democracy, what the populists do quite skillfully is to counterpose democracy to liberalism. They say we are the real Democrats, and the liberals are these metropolitan, cosmopolitan, remote liberal elites who are condescending to ordinary people and telling us all what to do. That's how Viktor Orban sets it up. So in a sense, they are speaking in the name of course, it's a very crude majoritarian version of democracy without the anti-majoritarian liberal checks and balances, but nonetheless, so there, number one, there's a real problem with focusing so much on democracy. Point number two, everybody is now talking the language of democracy. My research project at Oxford did an opinion poll with the European Council on Foreign Relations, and we asked the question in China, India, Turkey, and Russia, as well as the United States, who comes closest to having a real democracy? 77% of Chinese respondents said China. 54% of Indian respondents said India. It was a plurality even in Turkey, right? So the language of democracy, precisely because it was universalized in the rhetoric of the West in this period, has been devalued, right? It's been devalued and it's been problematic. So what I want to do is to take the spotlight back to freedom, and then really to ask what conditions are needed to realize freedom for all, or at least most citizens, more fully, namely a more egalitarian liberalism. So I'm actually just working on an essay for the New York Review of Books, taking the formula you mentioned, Europe whole and free, and asking how far we've got from to a Europe that's genuinely whole and free in these 34 years.
Which brings me actually nicely to my second last question, this business about Europe. So when you talk about Europe and Europeans today, or the enlarged West, which I thought was a very good and striking title in one section of your book, what exactly do you mean? And why am I asking this? Because especially also faced with NATO's northern enlargement, and also considering through that of course at the end of the Cold War, as we exited the Cold War, as we moved in Europe into that post-war world, the European neutral states in the north of Europe, of course, took a completely different exit from Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, because, of course, they were transparent, open societies, market economies, welfare states. So the one part that I kind of missed in your book at any point, although I can see when you are saying the driver is freedom, of course, they were free societies, is, where does the Nordic states experience fit in, especially when you also think of the trajectory of the last 30, 40 years, because for Finland as a neighboring state of Russia, obviously also had to manage that neighbor, but also sort of, position itself differently by, joining the EU, but not joining NATO, but now in order to maximize security to join NATO. And that ties to sort of a small joining to this particular question. This point is the Russia challenge. You talk about, on the one hand, Soviet Union as a superpower. On the other hand, you say, of course, Russian history, there's a long-term pattern of certain behaviors. And there's the Russian challenge and Russia's own identity struggles, Eurasian empire, how Europe, is that part of Europe? So your sort of picture of Europe, where do the Nordics, the neutral Nordics fit in? Where does Northern Europe fit in? And how do you square the circle with Russia? Just tell the audience a little bit about that.
Well, gosh, these are very large questions. I'll try and be brief because I know we have limited time. 2 points. Firstly, Europe doesn't end. It merely fades away, right? Just possibly, you might argue, it ends at the North Pole. But it merely fades away across the vast expanse of Russia, somewhere between St. Petersburg and Vladivostok, somewhere between the European side of Istanbul and the Iranian frontier, across the Mediterranean, which, of course, for the ancient Greeks and Romans was one civilizational space, the Mare Nostrum, and by the way, across the Atlantic too. I mean, Canada would be a perfect member of the EU, right? So there is no point at which we come to a line where we go from unambiguously Europe to unambiguously non-Europe. That's to the Russia point. And on the West, just not to make it too long, when people talk about the West, you need to stop for a moment and say, which West are you talking about? Because there are many senses of the West. As culture, as history, as values, it's at least 2,500 years. It's also the story John Eliot tells in his wonderful book about both the North Atlantic West and the South Atlantic West. Yes, the Anglophone, but also the Spanish and Portuguese-speaking West. I'm using the term, when I talk about the enlargement of the West, in a quite specific sense. The West as a geopolitical actor. And the West as a geopolitical actor comes into existence in the Second World War to face one common enemy, namely Adolf Hitler, Nazi Germany, and then continues in existence to face Joseph Stalin and his successors. And so ever since the end of the Cold War, there's been this question about what is defining this geopolitical West as an actor. And so, of course, now, with the war in Ukraine, Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and we once again having said that EU and NATO, in my view, have never been so close. And if you see it from Kiev, the Minister for Euro-Atlantic Integration has a Zoom backdrop which shows UA, Ukraine, linking the symbols of the EU and NATO. So they're two sides of a coin, right? They're the two strong arms of the West. So we could have a long and interesting conversation about multiple meanings of the West, but I think there's a quite specific, and this is to some extent, I'm simply stipulative on my part. I use the geopolitical West to mean the transatlantic alliance with its two core features of EU and NATO.
Excellent, thank you. And my final question, do you think the post-war and especially the post-war eras with the relative stability and prosperity were then historical anomalies?
Well, we don't know, do we? Because all we know is the past. There's a wonderful formulation by the novelist Evelyn Waugh, who used English very precisely. He said, the past is the only thing we possess certainly. But it's certainly, what is clearly the case, Christina, is that the war in Ukraine has exposed certain illusions of the post-war era, one of them being that history was clearly going our way. There were going to be setbacks, but that was a trend line of history. The second one being that peace could be achieved by non-military means, purely by diplomacy, dialogue, that economic interdependence was a good thing, and therefore having gas pipelines with Russia was a good thing for peace, right? So these illusions have been exposed, but also the fact that half the world has not stood with the West in condemning what we see as a war of recolonization, including India, Turkey, Brazil, South Africa. That's also been a revelatory moment, so that the period that starts with what looks like the ultimate triumph of the West, 1989 to 1991, ends in a sense with us suddenly waking up to the fact that the West is no longer able to set the agenda of world politics, and in some important sense, we're actually moving into a post-Western world. So that those things I think we can say, but of course we don't know what the character of the next era will be.
Thank you both. Before we get to our second discussant, let me just remind folks, if you want to pose a question yourself, use the raise hand function in Zoom. You can get in the queue now, and I can call on you when we get to that. Our second discussant this afternoon is Holly Case, an historian of modern Europe at Brown University, whose work focuses on the relationship between foreign policy, social policy, science, and literature in the European state system of the 19th and 20th centuries. She's the author of Beyond States, The Transylvanian Question and the European Idea During World War II, published by Stanford University Press in 2009, and The Age of Questions, or An Attempt at an Aggregate History of the Eastern, Social, Woman, American, Jewish, Polish, Bullion, Tuberculosis, and Many Other Questions over the 19th Century and Beyond, published by Princeton University Press in 2018. And she's currently writing a history of the role of consuls and consular reform in transforming the international system over the course of the last 2 centuries. Holly, welcome to the Washington History Seminar.
Thank you so much. Can you just give me a sense of how much time remains? I think I should shorten it up a bit.
10 minutes of questions, a comment, and a few minutes of back and forth on questions.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, so, okay, yes. I'll try to keep it very short. And I think it's helped along by the fact that Christina did a wonderful job of offering a summary of many of the book's themes and also a lot of what it does. And I'll just shorthand my original comment, saying that it reminded me a bit, because the book ends with D-Day, or a revisitation of the Normandy beaches. And I recall visiting a museum, the Museum of D-Day, near that beach recently, and seeing an exhibit, a panorama that shows images from the modern history of Europe. And it's a panorama that's above you and all around you, so it's on all sides. And this book rather reminded me of that panorama, with lots of overlapping and contrasting images that surrounds you, but it is somehow also above you because it's in the rooms where things are happening. And that includes not just where state leaders, but future state leaders are interacting, and but also it's populated with people in the open air, which is also a room where things happen. Demonstrators, refugees, soldiers, a retired dentist, for example. There's a lot in it. And as a reflection on history, it's also already a primary source. And I'd like to offer a couple of thoughts, perhaps to get the conversation going. So in a chapter titled Friedrichstraße East, Garton Ash writes, "If I close my eyes, I can still summon back to my nostrils the smell of plastic wood, cheap cleaning liquid, damp boots, and sweaty armpits in the passport control cabin." I liked this excursus into the olfactory, and lately I've been struck by how neutral the olfactory universe has become in so many places, especially in Europe and the United States. A lot of places, I think, strive to be and very nearly achieve odorlessness, and also relative silence or quiet, which is another matter. In his novel, too, the German writer Daniel Kehlmann vividly describes a scene from the Wars of Religion from the olfactory perspective, what it smelled like, actually stank like, to approach the military encampment of the Swedes. More recently, the olfactory landscape of Europe acquired a new dimension for me. It came as I was reading Homelands while visiting a friend in Hungary whose father had just suffered a stroke and was in the hospital. And we went to see him there, and the hospital smelled as hospitals do, which is to say, largely of urine augmented by the grotesque sweetness of infection. And as my friend spoke of her father's prospects and her family's life from here on out, I began to associate that smell with the future. And it made me think of Georgi Gospodinov's International Booker Prize winning novel from last year titled Time Shelter, which I'm going to read a brief selection from. He writes, "This sudden groundswell of people who have lost their memories today is no coincidence. They are here to tell us something. And believe me, one day very soon, the majority of people will start returning to the past of their own accord. They'll start losing their memories willingly. The time is coming when more and more people will want to hide in the cave of the past, to turn back. And not for happy reasons, by the way. We need to be ready with the bomb shelter of the past. Call it the time shelter, if you will." And it thematizes both the desire to flee from a fearful present, but also an aging population that is increasingly troubled by illnesses such as dementia, which produces a delayering of present experience and a kind of return to some version of the past that, in order to function, has to be recreated in some respects. At the same time, on that same trip to Hungary, I met a talented young Hungarian. He's just starting out his life with a new steady job, and he's eager to settle down, except that he's not very young at all. He's actually 38. And like so many his age, he's waited and waited and waited, like a surfer waiting for a wave that's never quite there, or never quite the right one. He's moved around from the US, East Asia, Europe. And earlier this summer, he recommended a book to me by a Hungarian author, roughly his own age, by the name of Dénes Kruskowski. And the book's title can be translated roughly as Those of Us Who Will Never Be. And he said it described a lot of the experience of his own generation that is constantly feeling like it's waiting in the wings. So I want to ask Timothy about European demographics, which is mentioned somewhat in the book, especially with Western immigration anxiety. But as you know, if there are millions of Poles and Hungarians and Romanians and Bulgarians and now Ukrainians trying to make their living in London or Paris or Madrid or Berlin or Vienna, that's millions absent from homes, schools, hospitals, and villages in their countries of origin, and many people who are also in between places and are, haven't started the thing that they keep deferring or waiting to start or waiting to return to. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts on Europe's demographic situation and how the horizons that are open and closing to various generations is affecting the mood in Europe. Also, this summer, while speaking to a young Polish man, the conversation turned to the standard concerns about the future. So a group of those present spoke of disastrous climate change, the war in Ukraine and its potential spread, further tips towards dictatorship. And the young man from Poland said, actually, none of these scenarios were the ones that he was primarily concerned with. He said the most likely horrific future he could imagine was one in which he would be called upon to shoot at migrants crossing the Mediterranean. And this was something I had not, it sideswiped me, but that he was concerned about this possibility. But after thinking about it, I think it is something I'd love to hear your thoughts on, because it strikes me that it doesn't come out of nowhere, that fear. Also, in your comments, you spoke about the war, in some respects, the Second World War being really over only in 1989 rather than 1945. And there's something in this perspective that rhymes a little bit with the current Hungarian constitution, that the period between 1944 and 1989 was not part of Hungarian history, is what the redrafted constitution says. And I was wondering, what you think we should do with the insights or with the thoughts from recent historiography on everyday life under socialism, or different periods of socialism, or how speaking about a war that goes on across the entire socialist period might affect people's sense of what their lives meant during that time period. And also, I'm thinking of the recent memoir by the philosopher Lea Ypi from Albania called Free, which thematizes this matter of freedom and its various definitions. And she is very critical of the period post-1989 and narrates her own return to Marxism after an excursus, through the period of transition. And so I'm wondering what you make of these kinds of experiences and thoughts. And I thought the question that Christina posed about democracy was also interesting in your answer about freedom. And I wanted to ask, because it seems to me that, yes, democracy has had a hegemonic run for a while. There hardly were any states that would claim to not be a democracy. And the debate was over what kind, and the transition was oftentimes framed as to democracy in the sort of transitology literature. But it seems to me as there might be a different kind of hegemony that's circulating, and I'd be keen to hear your views on it. And that is anti-imperial, anti-colonial, decolonial. And it's not that these are sort of built into the names of states, but that there is a tenor that suggests that the locus of legitimacy is in performative, decolonial, anti-colonial postures or positions. And this includes, people like Orban, who you mentioned is, frames the EU as a parallel or as a cognate for the Soviet Union, and speaks of them both as empires. For people like Vladimir Putin, who talks about the imperial incursions of the West. And not to mention, the various other manifestations of more or less legitimate around these claims of anti-imperialism and decolonial attitudes. And I was wondering, I think your perspective from Britain and also your comments about the trajectory of empires was very interesting in that regard, that they tend to be they cling to their power. But you also had it was a short section where you talked about the EU as maybe an empire, and this also rhymes a bit with what Orban says. But I think you meant it, of course, in a different key. But I would love to hear you flesh out this idea of are naming things, like what are the stakes in calling the EU something like an empire, and what if it's an empire, then maybe you could say like a bit more about what sort of empire it is and what that giving it that name does for the potential to think or rethink the present or the future. And finally, I was reading some of the philosophy of Richard Rorty recently, who he said that the task of philosophy was to provide guidance to the people of a particular time about what they should hold on to and what they might do better to let go of. And this seems like kind of something that historians could do. And I was wondering if you had to answer this question or adopt the position of the philosopher for a moment. What are the things that you think we should hold on to, and what should we let go of in terms of thinking the conception of Europe and its past and future? Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's an amazing array. Are we going to try and take a few questions from the audience too in the 1.5 hours, or?
Yes, we are.
Yeah, okay. If I may, Holly, I'd love to continue the conversation. That was such a fantastic smorgasbord that I'm going to pick and choose a bit, if that's okay with you, because I can't do it all. But I just want to say very quickly, I'm so glad you picked up on the quote-unquote ordinary people, the demonstrators, the refugees, the migrants, the soldiers, because the personal in the title, it's not just me. It's about Europe as experienced by people. And those people are not just Helmut Kohl and Vladimir Putin and Margaret Thatcher and so-called great men and women. They're very much, quote unquote, ordinary people who are often doing extraordinary things. I'll pick and choose quickly. Isn't it fascinating that now everything is framed in terms of empire? I just came from Yale yesterday, where Arne Westad was my interlocutor and is working precisely on this. Why now? Why not in the 80s and 90s, when European countries had only recently got rid of their empires? My grandfather was in the Indian civil service. He spent most of his life in India. It never occurred to me, as I was embarking on my European journey, that this was, a difficult and interesting issue. So I think there's a really interesting question about why now. Of course, part of the answer is that we now have a lot of Europeans with a migrant background, and many of them come from former colonial territories. So they are posing the question. And to the EU as empire, can I simply refer you to an essay I published recently in Foreign Affairs called Post-Imperial Empire, which argues that with the defeat of Russia, if Russia can be defeated in the war in Ukraine, we will have, for the first time ever in modern European history, a Europe without empires, either overseas or on land. But the paradox of this situation would be that in order to defend Europeans' interests and values against these outside great powers, Europe would have to acquire some of the characteristics of empire, not all of them, but some of the characteristics, right? So I think it's an interesting intellectual tool to thinking about the EU. I'm certainly not proposing we go off and call the EU an empire, right? Leah Ipi, just very quickly, the generational phenomenon. I talk a lot in the book about key generations, the 14ers, shaped by the First World War, the 39ers, the 68ers, the 89ers. And her generation are those who were young children before 1989, right? She was a young child in Albania. And she writes wonderfully about her experience, almost fairy tale experience of Enver Hoxha's Albania, where people referred to going off to labor camps as going off to educational training courses. They had a whole series of euphemisms. And what she really experienced was the horrors of the transition. By the way, Katja Hoyer's book on East Germany is another example of this, a book written by someone whose personal experience was only of childhood. On the demographic panic, which is a European condition, let me just say two things quickly. Well, three things. First of all, you'll remember the East German cabaretist and satirist Wolf Biermann said of the Politburo, they have communism. Wir haben den Kommunismus, right? Well, many people, as you know, in countries that have suffered from the brain drain in Eastern Europe, are saying that those young people, they have Europe, right? Because they're living in London or Paris or Berlin. So we do have this phenomenon where the return to Europe has happened individually for young, talented, energetic Europeans, but not for their countries of origin. Secondly, of course, because of the very low birth rates, which are characteristic of this period, we are dependent on the demography of people with a migration background. And as you know, the book, I have a lot about that phenomenon and the challenges of integration. I go to the banlieue around Paris, to Seine-Saint-Denis, where there are repeated riots. I speak to a man called Abdelaziz El Jawhuri, who says to me, c'est un pays hypocrite. It's a hypocritical country, France. It says liberté, égalité, and fraternité, but where's the liberté, where's the égalité, where's the fraternité for me? So these challenges of integration are going to be absolutely crucial to the future of Europe. Oddly enough, it's one of the few things that is actually going well in Britain, of all places, right? We have a Hindu prime minister, a black foreign secretary, and a Muslim mayor of London. So one of the tragedies of Brexit, that this model of successful integration, I mean, London is a city that is beyond multiculturalism, is not fitting more into the broader European context. Last point to what you said about your encounter with someone who said they're afraid of having to shoot migrants coming across the Mediterranean. Holly, we're very, very close to that already. We're maybe not shooting them, but the Coast Guard, there are well-documented cases of the Greek Coast Guard pushing ships back, migrant boats back. We are letting people die in large numbers in the Mediterranean. I have a chapter in the book called The New Iron Curtain, where I go to Ceuta, which is interestingly the first European colony on mainland of Africa. It's a Spanish enclave in North Africa. And if you go to the border to Morocco, you see a fence, a double fence more than 6 meters high, barbed wire, raked sand, searchlights, another fence, sensors, a special road for the army, the border guards. It looks exactly like the old Iron Curtain. I've looked at them both. So the tragedy of this period is we've taken an Iron Curtain down in the middle of Europe, but we're building a new Iron Curtain around the edge of Europe. And for me, that is one of the biggest moral challenges to contemporary Europeans, and particularly to contemporary liberal Europeans. How can we live with this new Iron Curtain that we ourselves have built, which, by the way, is reinforced by paying authoritarian regimes like Morocco or Algeria or Turkey to keep the migrants back or put them in camps in Libya? How can we live with this absolutely drastic contrast between the life chances of someone one side of the new Iron Curtain at Ceuta and just the other side of it, which really is actually the difference between life and death? So I couldn't agree with you more. I think this is one of the the largest moral and political challenges for Europe today.
Thank you both very much. We're going to open this up now. We have a number of hands that have been raised. I can call on you, and then we need you to unmute yourself and then ask the question. First up, as an old friend of the seminar, Jeffrey Herf. Jeff, unmute, join us.
Thank you, Eric. Timothy, seeing you with the background to Oxford brings fond memories of a conference we both participated in with Tony Judt many years ago at Oxford on memory and politics. And Tony was very acutely aware of criticizing mythologies. And as I thought of that, as I was listening to your discussion about the we, you referred to a we who participated in the fallacy of extrapolation and extrapolating the success of the European project forward. And my question is this. In the Cold War, there were many dissidents in Eastern Europe who didn't get listened to very well in Western Europe. And I wondered if that happened again in the post-wall era, because as you know, and perhaps I've not read your book, perhaps it's evident in your book, there were Cassandras in Germany, such as my friend Richard Herzinger, but many other people in Eastern Europe who were warning and warning and warning about Putin well before the invasion of Crimea in 2014. And the we that you refer to, who engaged in the fallacy of extrapolation, that is, leaders in Western Europe, would not listen to them, or dismissed them, or ignored them, or worse, called them warmongers. And so in my view, that had to do with intellectual misinterpretations of the Second World War and the Cold War, and also to a lot of money that was being made with Russian oil and gas. Perhaps in the book you interpret or discuss this issue of why the we didn't listen and pay attention, even as Putin was doing all the horrible things that you know very well that he was doing. So it's a good thing. It's very good to see you again, and I look forward to reading your book.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. The we in my book is liberal Europeans, and to some extent also, liberal Americans and Canadians. And I think you're absolutely right. We didn't listen seriously enough to a wide enough range of voices, those warning us, particularly from Eastern Europe, about Putin, but also those warning us what was going wrong in our own societies, right? From the left, but not only from the left. So I think that is absolutely right. There's a wonderful new book, which one or two of you may know, by a man called Joshua Chernis. It's called Liberalism in Dark Times. And on the examples of Camus, Aron, Niebuhr, and Isaiah Berlin, he argues that liberalism is misunderstood as simply a system, which is a characteristic post-war way of thinking about it, as in John Rawls. He says liberalism is an ethos, and it's an ethos that he counterposes to a politics of ruthlessness. It's an ethos that is looking for limits also in taking anything to an extreme, free market economics, for example. And which considers that means are as important as ends. And I think as we think about the renewal of liberalism, which is also one of the themes of this book, that's also a very important message, as is the example of Isaiah Berlin, who was much more interested in the critics of the Enlightenment and the critics of liberalism than he was in mainstream liberalism. So I think it's a very good point.
Thank you. We have a hand up from Hans-Georg Ripken. If you would unmute yourself, you might pose a question.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. That looks good. Yes, thank you very much, Professor Ash, as well as the other speakers, of course. That was very enlightening. I'm a PhD student from Germany on NATO enlargement and the debate in the 1990s. And while I was listening to your discussion, especially your discussion with Professor Spohr, I was wondering when you defended the term freedom against the term democracy, as democracy being claimed by so many populists around the world. Hasn't the term freedom been claimed in the very same way? If I look at Europe, then most of the populist agendas, starting with the AfD here in Germany, they also claim that they try to go for freedom, especially freedom from Europe. So how do we protect this term? How do we protect what we believe is freedom and freedom in Europe? From having the same path or going down the same path as the term democracy, and thereby also preserving this idea of Europe as a positive and a good future for us as a generation.
All terms of value are inevitably contested. And I would connect my answer to you to my answer to the last question. There was a very strong tendency among liberal Europeans, liberals altogether, to dismiss these critical voices from more extreme ends or more radical voices as so to speak, non-admissible, or as coming from the basket of deplorables, or as being fascist or Nazi or whatever. And I think actually it's really important to listen to these voices of angry discontent and try and understand what is behind it. So if you like, tough on populism, but tough on the causes of populism. And when you mentioned the AfD, one of the, as you know, I've worked on free speech, and one of the, rallying cries of the populists has been about free speech. And I think the first thing we actually have to do is to have a close look and see if we have been too restrictive in our interpretations of what is of the Overton window, as what is acceptable in debate. If we haven't, strayed towards a definition of liberty only for the liberals, right? And so I think we defend freedom by accepting this open, critical self-interrogation and self-correction, which is at the heart of the liberal tradition.
Thank you. Katrin Schultheis has a hand up. Please unmute. Join us.
Yes, hi. I haven't read your book, but one question that comes to mind is, how do you see ethnic nationalism with respect to this liberalism and this concept of freedom that you see as essential to the future of a successful Europe? Because that just strikes me as a contradiction, especially in the context of the crisis of migrants. But there's a really uneasy relationship between liberalism and nationalism, especially ethnic nationalism. Maybe you could say a few words about that.
Thanks for a brilliant question. Of course, in 1848, Christopher Clark has just written a wonderful new book about this. Liberalism and nationalism were seen to be marching arm in arm. And one of the interesting things about Ukraine is that once again, liberalism and nationalism, or if you prefer, patriotism, seem to be marching arm in arm. And I think this is another of those things that went wrong with liberalism in the post-war period, which was that we as liberals spent all our time talking about the international community, and indeed Europe, and we left the nation to the right, to the illiberal and anti-liberal right. And so we, as were implicitly accepted that if you want to talk about the nation, you're going to do it in a nativist, particularist, conservative ethno-nationalist way. That was a big mistake. One of the things we need to do as liberals is to revive the notion of liberal patriotism, to reclaim patriotism, but, and here's the key point, as civic patriotism, not ethnic nationalism, a patriotism which embraces all the citizens of our societies, including all those with a migration background. So I think it's a great question. The way to take on Viktor Orban is not just to keep invoking Europe, Europe, Europe in response, or international human rights in response. That's worth doing too. It's to reassert our own liberal version of civic patriotism.
Thank you. Let me squeeze in a question of my own here with regard to what you said a moment ago about speech and the need to listen to the voices of the discontented. In the book, in the chapter on Brexit, for example, you also make clear that to some degree, public opinion, and these are my words, not yours, is manufactured to a degree. You have the tabloids. And so you have robber baron media moguls basically putting forth a version of reality that's at odds with the Britain and the Europe that you are invested in. In Poland and in Hungary, you now have state-run media that similarly exclude voices across the board that aren't in agreement with their politics. So how does one deal with this issue of media control? Either by the private sector that is taking it in an extreme right-wing direction, or in the case of the two countries I just mentioned, state-run media that shape and frame discourse for their populations. This presents a serious challenge.
It's an absolutely crucial question. By the way, just on Eurosceptic voices, as I say in the book, my own father, the Eurosceptic who would undoubtedly have voted for Brexit if he'd been alive in 2016, and that does help me to understand why decent, honorable, intelligent people would vote for Brexit. And interestingly, to go back to Christina's point, when I pushed him about it, he said, for me, it's about democracy, right? We should be governing ourselves. So that, by the by, in the family, of course, the media system question is absolutely crucial. We are facing in mid-October a crucial election in Poland, probably the most important election in Poland since 1989. For my sins and a great danger to my health, I watch Polish state TV, and it is the hate hour from Orwell's 1984. I mean, it is extraordinarily crude but skillful propaganda for the ruling party, virulently anti-German, and mendacious defamation of the opposition. So there's a real issue there. And one reason why Britain has not become a hyperpolarized country like the United States or Poland is that we still have the BBC. We still have a genuine public service broadcaster where all the different voices, Remain, Leave, Right, Left, actually meet and interact. So that is absolutely crucial. And I think that, the European Union, if it's thinking about countries like Hungary and Poland, should spend much more time looking not just as rule of law narrowly conceived, but at the larger ecosystems that sustain a liberal democracy.
Thank you. I unfortunately have to draw this to a close. It's now 5:30, but I can tell you we could have gone on for much, much longer. There is a lot in this book that we didn't even get to, and I would encourage people to pick up a copy and to read this very readable and extremely thought-provoking and engaging book. My thanks to Timothy, to Christina, to Holly, and all of those of you in the audience. Please join us in 4 days' time on Monday, September 18th, when the Washington History Seminar returns to discuss a new book by Andrew Port of Wayne State entitled Never Again, Germans and Genocide After the Holocaust. Till then, thank you and good night.